As the movie begins, we meet 3 juvenile criminals who have been arrested for different offenses. Davis, aged 16, has been convicted of drug possession with the intention to sell, whereas Angel, aged 15, is found guilty of assault and auto theft. Likewise, Butch, aged 17, has been convicted of assault on a correctional officer at a different juvenile facility. These teenagers are transferred to Enola Vale Youth Correctional Center, just one of the many juvenile detention facilities for troubled teenagers that the system doesn't know what else to do with. Following this, Officer Sands, the superintendent of the correctional center, conducts the initial intake process for the boys. He immediately appears stern as he conducts thorough inspections on each of them with strict protocols. His main focus is on Butch, recognized for his aggressive nature and his previous offense of injuring an officer at another facility. He then gives the boys a rundown on the facility's rules that they must follow to earn the chance for release. Afterward, Officer Goodyear, a correctional officer and unit supervisor, escorts the boys to their designated unit. He then encourages them to show good behavior during their time in the correctional facility to get an early release. He also provides them with an overview of the ranking system of the inmates, with Level 1 being the starting point. Moving up to Level 2 involves being appointed as a trustee, a status granted to inmates who demonstrate positive behavioral changes. These trustees are set apart by their black polo shirts. Officer Goodyear then warns them that harming themselves or others could result in being placed in the special unit. These inmates are set apart by their distinctive orange suits. He goes on to explain that routine evaluations determine whether an inmate is inclined towards change or likely to remain in the facility for an extended period. Ultimately, the officer reassures the boys that they will be fine as long as they abide by the rules and quietly serve their time within the facility. Later in the dining hall, an inmate and trustee named Banks maliciously drops hot beans on Butch's hands. He goes to take a seat across from a fellow inmate named Max, who notices his injury and advises him to ignore such bullies. He explains to Butch that the most effective strategy for surviving in the facility is to keep a low profile, assuring him that eventually the bullies will lose interest and leave him alone. The following morning, all the inmates are assigned cleaning duties throughout the facility. Banks and his friends, Looney and Eckersley, target the new inmate, Davis. Asserting their dominance, they intimidate and bully him into surrendering his new boots. In the end, Davis is left with worn-out boots, with no choice but to comply with their demands. Shortly after, Officer Goodyear discovers Butch standing drowsily during his cleaning duties and orders him to continue. As he leaves, Banks and his friends begin taunting Butch and spitting on him from the floor above. Upon noticing him slacking off from a distance, the officer orders Butch to return to work. Fortunately, this causes the bullies to leave him alone, at least for the time being. That night in the dorm, Banks wakes up his companions and approaches Butch's bunk while he sleeps. In a display of their power, the trio covers Butch's mouth and mercilessly attacks him before leaving him miserable in his bed. The next morning, Officer Goodyear notices bruises on Butch's face and questions him about their origin. However, he doesn't give up any names and insists that he simply slipped and fell. The officer remains unconvinced by his explanation and suggests that they could file a report on the incident. Later, Officer Goodyear takes Butch to Officer Sands, who questions him about his injuries. Despite their efforts, he refuses to give out any information about his attackers and is confined to the solitary unit as a result. In the meantime, when Davis is alone, Banks and his friends approach him and offer him some cocaine to try. Without hesitation, he takes a hit, only to realize that it's unlike any he's experienced before. Banks then reassures him that the drug is strong because it's pure. Soon after, Davis begins to feel drowsy and experiences an unfamiliar high that leaves him unable to open his eyes. Initially appearing concerned, the bullies soon start mocking him and even drawing on his face while he struggles to breathe. Eventually, they retreat from the dorm as Davis panics due to the effects of the unknown substance. Shortly after, Officer Goodyear discovers him crawling towards the door, pleading for help. He quickly escorts Davis to the shower and gives him a solution to induce vomiting and expel the harmful substance from his system. After helping him to clean up, the officer transfers him to the solitary unit, where he can be isolated and monitored for his safety as he recovers from the effects of the drugs. It becomes evident that despite efforts at surveillance, drug abuse, along with psychological violence and terror, remain prevalent in the facility. The following day, both Davis and Butch are released from solitary confinement. As the inmates gather in the common room, some watch TV while others engage in a game of table tennis on the opposite side of the room. However, the situation quickly escalates when Looney and Eckersley begin hurling derogatory remarks at Davis, and even go so far as to throw the tennis racket at him. Fed up with the harassment, Davis decides to stand up for himself. However, before he can take further action, Butch enters the room and immediately unleashes his pent-up anger towards Looney. He then sets out to find Banks, the instigator of much of their torture. Davis also joins him and keeps watch outside in the hallway as Butch confronts the bully. Subsequently, Butch saves the worst for Banks and brutally beats him up in the restroom. Seizing the opportunity, Davis retrieves his boots and the two discreetly return to their dorm. Upon discovering Banks and his gang injured, Officer Goodyear questions them about the assailant, but they refuse to reveal any names. However, he begins to suspect that Butch is behind the attack, seeking revenge for the torture they had to face. Shortly after the incident, Officer Goodyear approaches Butch in the dorm and scolds him for retaliating, which could have serious consequences. Growing increasingly frustrated with the smug attitude, the officer then challenges him to a fight. Despite visibly boiling with anger, Butch surprises him by refusing to give in to his rage. Following this, Davis's mother visits him at the facility, but he chooses not to share all that he had to endure in the few days he's been in the facility. She then informs him that she's initiated a lawsuit against the institution for its failure to provide adequate supervision, resulting in her son being subjected to severe bullying. However, instead of finding comfort in his mother's actions, Davis becomes infuriated and abruptly leaves the visitation room. Similarly, Angel's father visits him and tells him that the family misses him. Rather than feeling comforted, he feels resentful since he believes that his family is not taking any action to secure his release from the facility. Later that day, Butch and several other inmates participate in an anger management class within the facility. Tensions escalate when an inmate named Frank gets into a physical altercation with another prisoner, leading correctional officers to intervene before the situation spirals out of control. Over the course of the next few days, Butch establishes his standing among the inmates after his confrontation with Banks. He also forms his own clique that includes Davis, Angel, and Max. He then extends his protection to them, offering a sense of security against potential threats from other violent inmates. A few days later, Officer Goodyear escorts Butch to meet with the commissioner, where he receives significant news regarding the investigation into the correctional officer he previously injured. It's revealed that more than 10 legal guardians have come forward, alleging that their children were also victims of physical assault by the same officer. This revelation makes Butch's case as an act of self-defense, potentially reducing his charges. The commissioner informs Butch that as long as he maintains good behavior over the next 2 weeks, the authorities will uphold the plea agreement and spare him from facing charges for assaulting the officer. However, any misconduct during this period would result in the withdrawal of the plea, and Butch would be sentenced to serve 4 years in an adult facility beginning on his 19th birthday. With this, the commissioner encourages Butch to make positive choices both during his time in the facility and upon his release into the outside world. In the dining hall, an inmate named Harold launches a vicious knife attack on another prisoner. Although the correctional officers intervene, they fail to apprehend the attacker. Meanwhile, Butch keenly observes another inmate in the hall, suspecting their involvement in ordering the assault. The following morning, he confronts said inmate and proceeds to strangle him. He then issues a stern warning to never lay a hand on the previously targeted guy again before walking away. In the meantime, Officer Goodyear submits a request for leave to Officer Sands, the superintendent, for his daughter's birthday. However, his request is denied. He's reminded of his responsibilities as the unit supervisor and urged to prioritize the operational needs of the facility over personal matters. Later, while Butch and his friends are doing their painting duties, Officer Goodyear gets into a heated argument with his wife about the denied leave request. Angel then jokingly paints an obscene depiction of their facility teacher, Miss Briggs. Upon discovering the offensive drawing, Officer Goodyear's anger flares, and he confronts Angel. Although Angel admits to the act, the officer's anger escalates, resulting in a physical altercation between the two. Despite Butch and Davis's attempts to intervene, they are unable to prevent him from attacking their friend. In the heat of the moment, Officer Goodyear throws Angel against the wall, causing him to strike his head on some pipes. The poor kid lies motionless on the floor as his friends frantically call out to him. They soon discover that his condition is serious after noticing that he's bleeding from the back of his head. Infuriated by the brutal assault on Angel, Butch attempts to retaliate against Officer Goodyear. However, before he can act, other officers intervene and subdue the inmates. The situation remains tense, although they desperately claim to have no part in the altercation and plead for attention to their friend's condition. As the chaos unfolds, Officer Goodyear appears visibly guilty for his actions. The other correctional officers single out Butch, known for his aggression, and place him in solitary confinement. Simultaneously, Angel is rushed away to the hospital for urgent medical attention, while the other inmates watch with concern. Taking advantage of Butch's absence, Looney and Eckersley seize the opportunity to take revenge on Davis. They locate him in the laundry room and subject him to a brutal beating. The attack escalates as they violently rape him before finally walking away. Moments later, another inmate stumbles upon the scene. His horrified and concerned expression convey the severity of Davis's traumatized state. Elsewhere, Officer Goodyear calls the hospital to inquire about Angel's condition, only to receive devastating news. Angel has tragically passed away over 2 hours ago. The following morning, Butch is released from solitary confinement and proceeds to the dining hall. Davis then approaches him to talk, but he remains closed off. That night, Davis requests permission to use the phone to contact his mother, but the officer on duty denies his request. Despite his persistent pleas, the officer assumes that he's homesick and insists that he can wait until morning to make the call. Feeling helpless and with no one to turn to, Davis returns to his bunk and tragically ends his life by slitting his wrists. Following the devastating news of Angel and Davis's deaths, the inmates unite to initiate a hunger strike during breakfast as a form of protest. Suddenly, the atmosphere becomes charged as the inmates, led by Frank, begin chanting, "Dead," expressing their collective sorrow. Suddenly, Butch loses control of his anger and hurls a chair against the wall, sparking a chaotic prison riot. The riot quickly escalates as inmates turn on the correctional officers, unleashing their pent-up frustration. Butch then targets Looney and mercilessly attacks him as revenge for his role in his friend's assault. In the midst of the chaos, the officers retreat briefly before returning in riot gear, armed with tear gas and rubber bullets to control the situation. During the commotion, Butch seizes the opportunity to escape from the facility. He manages to break through multiple doors and finally reach the yard outside. However, his taste of freedom is short-lived, as the officers quickly apprehend him and break his leg to prevent his escape. Butch is ruthlessly beaten and dragged back inside the building as the movie comes to an end.